watching remotely, you can't see what I can see. The congregation is following the proper principles, staying 6 feet apart, separated by rows, but we're getting more and more full. I think we're almost at capacity, not quite. I see a few spaces here that are still available. So if you're interested to come back to church, we still have room at the inn. I want to welcome everybody, our members, but most especially some of our guests today. There are a half a dozen faces that I don't recognize. So I just want to acknowledge you that you're here and let you know that you're welcome. We're very happy that you've joined us. I hope that it blesses you, your time with us today. One other announcement before we go into today's message. Our clerk, Sister Grace, does a great job of keeping us on top of all the announcements. And she already mentioned that the Greater New York Conference has put together a program called the Family Refocus Evangelism Week of Evangelism, that will start at the end of this month, actually. And I just want to let you know that we heard from the speaker this past week, as pastors we did, we were informed what some of the topics were. And it seems like they're very relevant to things that are happening right now. The series is focused around family life, including some of the stresses that young people go through, as well as the tensions in relationships. So it will run from May 22nd evening until May 29. And I'm just encouraging you to keep watch for that. We will stream it on our Jackson Heights webpage. All right, so let's continue with our series on the teachings of Jesus. From the beginning of this year, from January, the new associate pastor and myself, along with the elders, we agreed that it would be appropriate and a blessing to all of us if we actually spent some quality time looking at what Jesus himself taught. And as for me, I can tell you that I've been going slowly through the Gospel of Matthew right from the beginning of the year. I mean, there's so much information there, so much good stuff for us to grasp. I did notice that there is a saying that comes up in Matthew chapter 9 that Jesus actually repeated. We don't know how many times he repeated it in the course of his ministry, but we know that Matthew's gospel itself includes it twice, in Matthew chapter 9 and in Matthew chapter 12. However, it's actually in the Bible 3 times, because the saying is a quote from the prophet Hosea. And it's what I'm talking about is the saying where Jesus says, "Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice." So it actually appears 3 times in the Bible. And today we're going to look at all 3 of those occurrences. We're going to analyze what the intended meaning is in each situation, and then see how it might apply to us today. So that's our goal. I will make a declaration as we start off. I am convinced that this saying of Jesus is one of the most important principles of the biblical religion that we can find in all of the Bible. So again, we're going to look at them one by one, analyze them in their own situation, and then see what we learn from that. So can you turn first, please, to the book of Hosea. Hosea the prophet, and chapter 6. Lamar has read that to us already. I'll read first the passage and then give a little bit of the background to it so we understand, because we're jumping right in the middle of the book, obviously, and we want to get a running start here. So let me read Hosea chapter 6, starting with verse 4. I'm reading the New American Standard Version, and there's a reason I'm mentioning that, and you'll notice as we go along. So God is speaking through the prophet Hosea, and he's addressing the people called Ephraim. That's also the northern kingdom of Israel, right? And he says this: "What shall I do with you, O Ephraim? What shall I do with you, O Judah?" That's the southern kingdom. "For your loyalty is like a morning cloud, and like the dew which goes away early. Therefore I have hewn them. Now, that's not a common English word. Hewn, it means like chopped. I have hewn them in pieces by the prophets. I have slain them by the words of my mouth. And the judgments on you are like the light that goes forth. So God is lamenting. He says, you've been disloyal. You've been disloyal. You've turned away from me. And I've sent the prophets to chop you, and I've sent judgments to stir you up. And this is what he says in verse 6. For I delight in loyalty rather than sacrifice, and in the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. Now you'll notice right away that in my version rendered in English, the word here is, I desire loyalty rather than sacrifice. We are actually more used to the word mercy. Am I right? Well, let me explain a little bit about why that is, just so that you know, and we can put that out of our minds and go on with the thought. The Old Testament was written originally in Hebrew mostly, right? There are portions in Aramaic in the book of Daniel. But just like today, not everybody spoke the ancient language. So even the Old Testament in itself had been translated into other tongues so that the people could read it. In the time of Jesus, the apostles and the people in Palestine actually read the Greek translation. In the Hebrew, the word is loyalty, as in my translation here. But in Greek, it went over to the word mercy. So that's why you'll see both. And that's why Jesus himself will quote the word mercy, because they were using the Greek translation, in fact. But aside from that, there's something we can learn from the word. But I want to look now at what the passage is saying. As we just saw, and if you go back and read the rest of Hosea, you will see that God was lamenting because the people had turned to idols. God was the one who in their past had saved them from Egypt, had brought them through the wilderness, had helped them to cross the Red Sea and then the Jordan River and get established in the land that was known as Canaan, right? The promised land. And yet, as you know from reading the Old Testament story, the people would be loyal for a little while to God and then most of the time not, right? So God was addressing this issue, their disloyalty. And yet, what he says here in verse 6, I delight in loyalty rather than sacrifice, and in the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. What it shows is, even though they had turned away from their loyalty to God, they were still bringing all the temple offerings and the sacrifices. In other words, they were still doing all the things that count as religious practices. Am I right? They were doing the things that were actually written in the law for them to do in their worship of God. And yet God says, look, I'm not interested in that. There's something that's more important than that, even though it was required in the law. God is saying that what I'm most interested in is faithfulness, as it says here, loyalty. By the way, the Hebrew word that comes up in Hosea is a one that's very common and well known to us. It's hesed, which we don't need to worry about. But it's the word where God talks about himself and he says, I'm faithful to many generations, showing mercy, right? That word is the same word. It means covenant loyalty. It means once you enter into a commitment, once you enter into a contractual relationship with someone, a friendship, a love relationship, that word here means you're going to keep your end of the bargain. You're going to uphold your part of the agreement without fail. So what God is saying to the people here in the day of Hosea is, this is really what I want. Yeah, okay, the worship, the sacrifices are all well and good, but that's not the most important thing. What's more important to God, we see from this passage, is for them to be loyal to him. And not only that, if you go back and read other parts of Hosea, once they lost their committed loyalty to the person of God, they started to mistreat each other. Because this is another level of loyalty, right?
This is a different level of loyalty. Our loyalty is not only to God directly, but he put us in a group. We have certain commitments to each other. So in this case, in this saying here, when Hosea the prophet speaks to them and says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, or I desire loyalty and not sacrifice, the word sacrifice is talking about the real sacrifices that you brought into the temple. And the word mercy is the word for loyalty, commitment to each other, being honest with each other, taking care of each other. So you see what it means there in the original context. Now let's shift to where Jesus uses the expression. If you go to Matthew, please, Matthew chapter 9, and we'll read it again, and we'll get a sense of the setting and how it comes up in this passage. So Jesus, in the early part of the chapter, he's still becoming known, and he's still gathering disciples. Watch what it says in verse 9. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting in the tax collector's booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. Then it happened that as Jesus was reclining at the table in the house, this is Matthew's house, no doubt, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were dining with Jesus and his disciples. So now tax collectors and sinners, quote unquote, are spending time with Jesus. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, not to Jesus directly, they said to the disciples, "Why is your teacher eating with the tax collectors and sinners?" But when Jesus heard this, he said, "It is not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick." Then he adds something. He says, "But go and learn what this means. I desire compassion and not sacrifice. For I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners." So we're looking at this phrase again in different settings, and we're trying to understand what the words mean in each instance, right? So in this case, the Pharisees, we always think of them as terrible people, and they certainly made a mistake, but they were very, very serious about their religion. That's what they were all about. They wanted to make sure that they followed everything that God had told them to do as far as they were able. So in their minds, they had calculated what would be pleasing to God. And they came up with the idea that what we should do, if we want to be pious, if we want to be pure before God, we should stay away from anyone who doesn't seem to be practicing all the requirements of God. So in that sense, their way of sacrificing, we're looking at the meaning, right? We're looking at the meaning of the word in this setting. Their way of sacrificing was by following what they considered purity codes to the letter, following it to the letter, was by limiting who they would associate with and actually categorizing some people as unclean, right? So this is their idea of religion. And it wasn't just them. The ancient world had a lot of this kind of thinking. But what does Jesus say here? And what does he illustrate? If we had to define the word mercy, or in my translation, it says compassion, the Greek word eleos, right? If we wanted to define that word from this story, how is Jesus manifesting mercy? Well, this is what he's doing. He's extending a welcome to people who otherwise were the outcasts and the outsiders, right? This is the meaning of the word mercy in this story, in the action, right? He is bringing people back into the community who were otherwise pushed to the margins and looked down on. That's what the word mercy means in practice. You could say he's healing the rift. He's healing the division in the community and bringing people back in. Not only that, he's showing respect to these people who, as I said, were looked down on by the religious leaders of their day. So again, what we see here in the story is the definition of these words, mercy and sacrifice, in a little different setting, right? And they have a little bit of a different nuance in each situation. But there's one more. Take a look now at Matthew chapter 12.
And remember what we're going to do, we're looking at the meaning in the context. Then I'm going to see if we could cull out some principle from this. Matthew chapter 12, and we'll read right from the beginning. Let's see. And we know this story because it involves the Sabbath, and so we always focus on the Sabbath issue related here. But there's other things happening, right? Chapter 12, verse 1. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples became hungry and began to pick the heads of grain and eat. But when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples do what is not lawful to do on a Sabbath." And in a way, they were right, you know. If you go back to the story of the manna, remember what God said? Don't go out of your house. Don't even go looking for manna. He said, you remember the story. If you pick too much on the weekday, it's going to become rotten overnight. But on Friday, I'm going to give you enough that it'll carry over. So in a way, they had a point, right? There was a principle embedded in the scriptures themselves that suggested, yeah, we shouldn't be doing this food gathering thing on the Sabbath. Let me finish the story. But Jesus answered them, and he said, "Have you not read what David did when he became hungry, he and his companions? How he entered the house of God, and they ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those with him, but for the priests alone." Then Jesus goes on, "Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and are innocent? But I say to you, something greater than the temple is here." Look how many issues he's bringing up right in this passage, right? All the different arguments he's using. Now, we're not going to look at those because we're leading to the saying. But go back later today and read this passage again and see all the different shades of meaning that Jesus uses to defend his disciples. He goes on to say in verse 7, though, this is the culmination. "But if you had known what this means, I desire compassion and not sacrifice," or mercy, right? "You would not have condemned the innocent." So this is the third place in the Bible that this phrase comes up. What do these words mean here in this setting? Here's what I would like to suggest. For the Pharisees, their following of their enacting of the word sacrifice, right, was to make sure they followed all the religious rules and regulations. That's what sacrifice means here. It's like we're not going to take care of people's needs because these other things take priority, right? The rules and regulations come first. And as I said a minute ago, there is some biblical backing for that. This is not just something they made up out of thin air. Sacrifice in this case, sacrifice, the thing that Jesus is saying that God doesn't hold in high value comparatively. Sacrifice means to be careful, to obey the letter of the law and the regulations. And you know what? That can seem right. That seems right on a certain level. It's easy for us to assume, to fall into the idea that the essence of the religious life, the essence of our relationship to God is to make sure we follow everything he says. But what does mercy mean here? What does mercy mean here? Mercy is the thing that God wants. And it's very clear. Mercy in this case means meeting human needs, meeting the needs of somebody, an actual need. And get this, we're not just talking about the emotional need, maybe at a time of grief or alienation, or somebody who is growing up and having a hard time adjusting, which happens, right? We're not just talking about emotional needs. We're talking about bodily needs, physical needs. And Jesus himself is saying, my disciples are eating grain. You are upholding this other emphasis in religion. But what I want you to know is to understand what God meant when he says, actually, I desire this. I desire mercy. I desire compassion, not that. And he's actually talking about meeting physical needs. How do you like that? Remember what I said? This principle is wide-ranging. This statement, I should say, is wide-ranging. The underlying principle goes that deep. It's foundational. And that's what I want to look at now. So far, we looked at the passages themselves. We looked at 3 uses of this expression, and we saw that in each case, it had a different shade of meaning. The word sacrifice meant a different thing in each of these settings. The word mercy meant a different thing in each of these settings, right? So it shows that this phrase is very versatile, right? It can take on a lot of different nuances. But what we want to do is we want to get down to bedrock and see if we can define what the principle is, if we can identify what is the dynamic that hooks all of these things together. That's what we want to do today. And the way I would say it is this: what does this expression in all 3 of these locations tell us about biblical religion, about the religion of Jesus and his Father and the Holy Spirit? Now, if I had stopped the sermon here and I said, okay, church, go home this afternoon and you try to figure out what pulls all of these things together, I would imagine that there's a lot of different ways that we could phrase it, right? Let's face it. There's a lot of different ways to identify what the underlying issue is. But the word that came to me as I was meditating on this is the word wholeness. There's something about these 3 uses of the word mercy versus sacrifice that suggests to me that what God is interested in is promoting wholeness and restoring things that are broken. Let me show. In all 3 of these cases, the word sacrifice has a commonality. It means trying to act according to the religious observance that we believe God would be pleasing for, right? Like in Hosea, the people, they weren't living right, but they were still bringing the sacrifices to the temple. They were still bringing the offering and everything else. So they were trying to follow the religious prescription, and that to them was their way of worshiping God. Jesus says no. Hosea says no, that's not the way. For the Pharisees, they believed that the way that they pleased God was to keep themselves piously pure, right? And holy, untouchable, right? But the word mercy in each case has a little bit of a different meaning. Let's go back to Hosea. Hosea was chastising his contemporaries because they had lost loyalty both to God and to each other, right? It was a relational thing. They were in a relational commitment, a contract with each other, and yet they weren't fulfilling their end of the contract. So people were broken. So the relationship was broken. There were people who were being oppressed and exploited. So in this case, mercy meant the opposite of that. Mercy in that setting means do what it takes to build up trust. Do what it takes so that relationships can become strong. Keep faithfulness with each other. Be honest with each other. Don't be ripping each other off and exploiting each other. So in that case, the word mercy means to do what it takes to make relational wholeness. That's my word, right? Again, you can come up with other words, but I'm explaining how it occurred to me. In Matthew chapter 9, the issue was a matter of inclusion. The Pharisees' way of going about things was to make sure they kept pious and holy by avoiding certain people. But Jesus came and he looked at the situation where one group of the community was here and the other group was there, and he said, no. This is not healthy. This is not whole. We need to do something here. So in Matthew 9, mercy, that which promotes wholeness, is by bringing the community back together, taking away that rift. It's by including people, right? It's by showing respect and establishing harmony among the whole unit. And then in Matthew chapter 12, the word mercy, the word wholeness, I should say, the manifestation of mercy, the word mercy in terms of wholeness means taking care of people's needs. And as I said, in this case, it's physical needs, but it could also apply to emotional needs, social needs, spiritual needs. If people are broken, the will of God is for us to make them whole as far as we are able. This is the 3rd level. When you take these all together, we're starting to get a picture of what God's will really is. And as I said, I've used the term, what is biblical religion all about? It's about bringing things back together. It's about making things whole. It's easy for us, very easy when we're dedicated to God, when we've come to fall in love with God and we learn, all this information in the Bible. It's easy for us sometimes to think that religion is all about religious practices, things that we do in church, things that are devotional oriented. But in Jesus' saying, quoting Hosea, apparently, as good as those things might be, that's not what God thinks is the most important. Is that clear? Does that come across in the story? So what we've seen here in these three expressions, the contrast between sacrifice and mercy, is we're getting an idea of what makes God really happy. Now, one last thing I want to add here. I don't know if you pay attention to the bulletin, but I have an old one here. I titled the sermon, Mercy and Sacrifice, which is not exactly what Jesus said, right? Jesus said, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. So why did I do that? Because there's actually another definition of the word sacrifice that's not so bad. Let me explain. In Hosea, the word sacrifice meant actual physical sacrifices, right? That you brought to the altar. In Matthew, the word sacrifice had that idea like we stay away from others, we try to follow all the rules, right? Those are the two definitions of the word sacrifice in this story. But in everyday language, we also use the word sacrifice in a different way, a third way that's not so bad. So this is not the two terms that are used in the story, but since it's such a common word, I felt like it was important for me to make the distinction between these uses of the word sacrifice and the more common way. So what do we say? When we say we're going to sacrifice for a cause, we're going to sacrifice so that we can accomplish something. That's a different use of the word, right? For example, suppose I had planned on Sunday to take a day off and really get the new garden installed. I'm just making this up as I go. But then I get a call from somebody who's sick and needs to be taken to the hospital, right? I sacrifice, this is the way we use the word, I sacrifice the time that I was going to spend putting in the garden. I give that up for the sake of doing what? Helping somebody, right? I'm not just giving up my time in the garden because I think that's a pious thing to do and God is going to be impressed with me because I said, well, God, I would really like to spend Sunday putting in the garden, but just to show you how much I love you, I'm not going to do that for no reason. You see the difference? So when we use the word sacrifice in everyday language, it means we're going to give something up because something else came up, that there's a need. You get the difference, right? And a lot of times it could be financial thing. It's like, we were saving some money, but we find out that one of our relatives had to go to the hospital and they didn't have enough money to cover it. So what we say is we sacrifice the money, not just for no reason, right? But for a purpose. So I want to make it clear that this definition of the word sacrifice is not a bad thing because we're giving something up for the sake of what? Bringing wholeness, right? We're giving something up for the sake of accomplishing something. There's nothing wrong with that. It's the same word, but it's used in a different way. And I just wanted to point that out, that this third kind of sacrifice is not bad. But it's very important for us to identify why this third form of sacrifice is not bad. It's because you're sacrificing for the sake of showing mercy, right? You get it? You're sacrificing for the sake of showing compassion on people. So it's not so much the sacrifice that counts. The sacrifice is what we're called upon to do. But the real goal and the important part is that we're going to help people with this. We're going to establish wholeness. We're going to bring back wholeness and well-being into the world. That's what it's all about. That's what biblical religion is all about. I don't think God is impressed by religious offerings just in their own sense. Although, that's part of our devotion to God too, but it's not his highest thing. That's not the key element of biblical religion. That's not the essential core of God's will. And remember, the word desire means that's what God wants. If I desire something, that means that's what I want. Am I right? It's the same word. So I could say when God desires mercy, that means his will is mercy. Jesus said, sacrifice is not the most important thing, but mercy. All right. To sum up then, we looked at 3 passages where this phrase comes up in the Bible, where Hosea, speaking for God, and Jesus, speaking as God, says that this is my will. I don't really want the sacrifice so much. What I really want is mercy. I think this is an outstanding theme that gives us a deep insight into who God is and what his way of life really is. I desire mercy. In the book of Hosea, mercy meant covenant faithfulness. It means dedicating yourself to the people whom you love. If it's God, we stay true to God. If it's our family, we make sure we dedicate ourselves. And by extension, it's the whole human race, really, right? We're all in this together. So from Hosea, we learn the meaning of mercy and its faithfulness, its covenant faithfulness. From Matthew 12, and I'm jumping there first, I'll explain why in a minute, we find out that mercy is caring enough to meet people's needs. Not just holding yourself aloof and saying, oh, wait, by the way, I have to go to church now, so I can't help you, acting all religious but ignoring people's real needs. No. From Matthew chapter 12, we learn that God's will is to meet people's needs as far as we are able. From Matthew chapter 9, which is where I started when I was reading through this, and I seized on this passage, we learn, get this, that mercy is caring enough to bring people back in, to make wholeness, to restore fellowship between divided peoples. And you know what? I got to thinking about it just this morning, that when you look at the biblical story as a whole, isn't that what it's all about? Isn't that what it's all about in the end? When the New Jerusalem comes down from heaven and the dwelling of God is with human beings again, and all people dwell together. This is God's will.